Okay, we're speaking today with Annalee Newitz, who I've been a big fan of for many years. She's a journalist who writes about science and technology, popular culture subjects. And I want to start with a little bit of your history, Annalee, because you go back to a journal that was a very influential journal called Bad Subjects. Can you tell us about Bad Subjects?
Yeah, that's definitely going back into the sort of Jurassic days of the internet. Bad Subjects was a journal that I co-founded back in the early 1990s when I was a graduate student at UC Berkeley. And we initially were printing it on paper, but because our subjects were often things like popular culture and current events as they connected with radical politics, we were very interested immediately when we heard about putting things on the internet that weren't just computer science projects. We wanted to get it online. And so luckily we had a friend who helped us put it on Gopher. So we were a Gopher journal for a while until this magical thing called Mosaic, which eventually became the Netscape browser, came along. And so we went on the web in around 92. And actually, Bad Subjects is still publishing today. I'm not involved anymore, but they're still going strong.
Gopher was like an FTP drop site or something. You could pull files on and off of there.
Yeah, we had FTP. I mean, it's still every issue comes out as a PDF, and you can get it via FTP. And it's actually fun to go back and look at some of those issues that we did in the early 90s and see some of the things that we tackled. The sort of defining cultural moment that made us want to start it was that we watched a Michael Jackson video for Black or White, which included kind of a weird combination of morphing software and racial commentary. And we said, okay, we have to start a journal because we don't know how to explain this other than by talking about it. So we need to talk about the connection between special effects and racial identity, and that's just going to be the way it is.
Well, that leads into the next thing on my list, which is that you published a book called White Trash, Race and Class in America back in 1997. Was that an outgrowth of your doctoral work?
It was connected to some of the work I was doing for my doctorate, although it was actually much more closely associated with work I'd done for Bad Subjects. I co-edited that book with Matthew Ray, who was part of the Bad Subjects collective. We called ourselves a collective because we thought that was awesome. So he and I had both been very interested in looking at whiteness in the context of multiculturalism, and in looking at how, in fact, one of the things that happens with white identity in pop culture is that it's sort of treated as the norm and not as a particular racial identity, which of course it is, with its own history and its own traditions. I think now that's something that maybe is a little bit more obvious than it was in the 1990s. Now that today you can have a book like Things That White People Like, and people kind of get that joke. At that time, when we were working, those kinds of jokes really hadn't become possible yet in a mainstream way. So we wanted to talk about how whiteness could be talked about as a particular racial category, and one good way to do that is to look at poor whites, people who often get called rednecks or hillbillies or white trash, and look at how they had been portrayed in pop culture and in history and in sociology. And so that's kind of how that book came about, although I did have a chapter on whiteness and zombies in my dissertation, which later became another book. So whiteness all over my early work.
What's this funny movie that's out about zombies? Zombieland?
Yeah.
It seems like there are an awful lot of Appalachian zombies that they're whacking in Zombieland.
Yeah, no, there's actually, as you often find zombies connected with redneck culture, particularly now that zombies have become so popular. I think zombies are kind of the alter ego of the poor white in American culture. I think that's a uniquely American thing. I don't think that that's the case in Europe at all. I think it represents something different.
Well, you have also written a book called Pretend We're Dead, Capitalist Monsters in American Pop Culture, and I have not had a chance to read it yet. I intend to. on my to read list. But I understand, yes, I understand that one of the things you address in there are these cultural valences and meanings of zombies and vampires in culture.
Yeah, it's basically a book about representations of monsters in pop culture. And I look at 5 different monsters. The first 2 chapters are about mental monstrosity. So I look at serial killers and mad doctors who kind of look like the rest of us but have sort of monstrous psychology. And then I also look at the undead and cyborgs. And the final monster is audiences for pop culture, because as you know, oftentimes audiences for popular film and TV are portrayed as being even more monstrous than monsters in film. And so, yeah, I basically look at each of these monsters in the context of shifts in economic fortune throughout the 20th century and how representations of these monsters kind of changed as the economic plate of the country changed. It's particularly interesting, since we were talking about zombies, to think about this with zombies who sort of started out being represented as these, like, if you look at a movie like I Walked with a Zombie, which everyone should see. It's a fantastic, amazing film with a very inauspicious title. It's basically all about how natives on St. Sebastian turn a group of former white plantation owners, I mean, they're still white, but they're formerly plantation owners, into zombies. And it becomes kind of revenge of the natives on the white people. And you still see that story being told, even now, where zombies and ghosts become sort of vessels of revenge for oppressed people. And so you get a movie like Tales from the Hood or a movie like Bones, which are both kind of like blaxploitation movies, but made by black filmmakers with black characters in them, dealing with the history of, often in a humorous way, dealing with the history of white oppression through vengeful ghosts and vengeful zombies. And then, of course, you have redneck zombies as well, which is a staple of the genre. So, is
it too easy? Is it too easy to say that zombies, because they usually appear in huge numbers and are kind of implacable, that they represent middle-class fears about working-class and poor people, while vampires, because they're kind of aristocratic, represent fears of aristocrats and people who are wealthier and more powerful than us?
I think that's a good observation. I think that often happens. I think that generally vampires are still associated with Dracula, who's an aristocrat, although there's plenty of examples of sort of white trash vampires, like in the film Near Dark, where they're basically vampires going around in a mobile home slaughtering farm kids. But I do think that that's true. I think generally vampires are associated with like a kind of a secret ruling group, and zombies are the uncontrollable hordes that you're trying to keep out of your gated community.
Now, you started IO9, 2 years ago?
Yep, that's right.
To IO9.com, and right out of the gate, you started publishing things at IO9 that I had wanted to look at myself for years. So, for instance, a study of the relationship of violations of the Prime Directive in Star Trek over the last 40 years to the politics of their time, or Doctor Who's political interventions to the politics of the UK. And really interesting social science analyses, which you were able to present in a very cool way without all the trappings of academe. So has that been a part of, obviously it's part of your background to do these kind of intensive culture analyses, but is that part of the mandate of IO9?
Well, IO9 is a futurism blog, which focuses a lot on science fiction, because science fiction is the entertainment wing of futurism. And, from the start, we did want the site to be dealing with meatier topics, to not just be reporting on the latest TV shows and who would be cast in them, although we do plenty of that. If all you wanted to do is get kind of a People magazine view of science fiction, you could certainly find that on IO9 as well. But yeah, we wanted it to be something that was that would contain essays that would help people think meaningfully about the future and to think meaningfully about how their pop culture is sending a message about ways that we might change ourselves as a civilization, ways that we are destroying ourselves. And that's always been an important part of the science fiction tradition, even though people think of science fiction merely as being escapist. It's never been that. Even when it's being escapist, even when it's Star Trek, which is, swashbuckling, space adventure, there's still really heavy questions about where we need to go as a civilization if we're going to survive.
Well, a couple of weeks ago, you pointed to the research of a young woman who's doing work on all the different representations of apocalypse in, was it just literature or film? Maybe
she looked at just literature throughout the late 19th and early 20th century.
And she had categorized the different kinds of apocalypses and shown that certain kinds of apocalyptic anxieties were increasing and others were declining. I thought that was fabulous.
Yeah, she did a great job. I guess that was her undergraduate thesis. And yeah, wow. She looked at hundreds of books where she chronicled how these books showed the world ending. And one of the really interesting things that she found out, along with the obvious things like in the 1950s, suddenly nuclear war was a big fear. Although actually fears of nuclear war started in 1930s novels, she found. The biggest thing that was interesting was that about 20 years ago or so, a lot of books about the apocalypse stopped identifying a cause for the apocalypse. So no longer was it nukes or biotechnology run amok or, some terror from space. It was just the world ended, civilization fell, and here we are in a post-apocalyptic world. And that was really interesting to me. It seemed like it seems sort of terrifying that we are now so unclear on what the future might bring that we can't even imagine in our own fiction how civilization might fall.
Is it because we begin to realize how fragile the edifice of civilization is, and so it could be any number of things. You really don't need to specify it because just one thing could trip it off and chaos could bring it all down. Yeah,
but it seems like, it's terrifying that we can't even point to one possible problem. Like, is it the environment? Is it, a meteor? It seems like we're in a moment historically, and maybe you've seen this too in your work. We're kind of at this moment where people just aren't sure what's going to happen next, and it's kind of creating this paralysis of imagination.
I absolutely agree. One of the things that's always puzzled me about culture analysis that I have attempted in the past is trying to figure out the balance to apply of whether a cultural object reflects society or whether it reflects the industry and the peculiarities of the culture industry or just the artist's intention. And, I think the default is to assume that there's something, when you see an increase in depictions of vampires of a certain sort, that it's reflecting something about the culture or the politics of the time. But it could also be the nature of the industry. And so you get these big differences in cultural trends, I think, between literature, science fiction literature, fantasy literature, and science fiction film. And I think that has a lot to do with what can be sold at the cost that most science fiction film has to incur.
Mm-hmm. So you don't think it's as much what the audiences are looking for as it is like what year what executives are willing to sign off on in the Hollywood.
I'm open to. I guess I'm open to a variety of interpretations. I think film probably does reflect more of the zeitgeist because you have to, in order to make your nut in the film, you have to be able to get a wide opening, and that means you have to draw in people who just aren't a subcultural crowd. Whereas with literature, you can publish a limited run of a novel that might, reflect a subculture. I guess you can do the same in film, but it's just always drawn me up short to exactly say how much any particular culture object really reflects society. I don't know whether you've thought about that.
Yeah, I think it's always a combination, right? It's always what executives think people want to pay for, and then actually I think, things become popular based on, people's genuine desires and interests. So it's always an interplay, and it is hard to know for sure. So I wonder if we should shift gears and talk a little bit about the analysis, the kind of cultural analysis that you're working on right now. You told me you were writing a lot. Are you working on a new book?
Well, I'm working on a new book, but it's not about this. The book that I'm working on is called Cyborg Buddha, which is about the use of neurotechnology to modify behavior and its impact on our understandings of spirituality and religion. But I have been working for the last 15 years on accumulating information about depictions of intelligent others and intelligent non-humans in literature, film, and television, and looking for trends in that kind of stuff. So when I say that I've been drawn up short, it's in my previous efforts to write about this data set that I've been building. So one of the questions is, for instance, if I collect all the top-grossing films or the best-selling novels of a year, I may be missing some things which fly below that radar, which have an enormous cultural relevance. So the Tolkien trilogy was never a best-selling novel in any of the years that was ever published. But of course, it's been one of the most influential, cultural sets of images that we have. So I don't know, but for our interview, I actually pulled up last year's best-selling films, top-grossing films, and this year's top-grossing films. So we have Dark Knight, Iron Man, Indiana Jones, Hancock, WALL-E, Twilight, Transformers, Harry Potter, Star Trek, X-Men. It seems like there's a real science fiction and fantasy turn. Setting aside whether I can interpret any of the trends or not, it's obvious that there's more science fiction and fantasy that's become massified in recent decades. You agree with that?
I think that that's true. And actually, since you brought up the idea of intelligent others, I mean, almost every single one of those films deals with the idea of an intelligent other in some way. Either it's a mutant or it's aliens, or magical creatures that we, didn't know existed until they were kind of revealed. I think it's interesting because one of the things that science fiction does so well is think through that idea of what does it mean to meet intelligent creatures that aren't human, which of course is really just a way of talking about what does it mean to meet intelligent humans who aren't from our culture, and who don't share our values and don't have any clue why we have the cultural preferences that we do. Even as I was saying earlier that this is a time when maybe our imaginations are failing us a little bit about the future, there's a hunger on the part of audiences, I think, to think about that future and try to figure out, what are we going to be like when we can wear a smart exoskeleton and be like Iron Man? What will that do to our identities?
Right.
That's something that you've thought about a lot. You've written so much interesting stuff about transhumanism and posthumanism, which is there a difference between transhumanism and posthumanism? Am I wrong in thinking that there's some kind of difference between them, or are they used interchangeably?
No, not used interchangeably. Posthumanism, I think, refers more to a set of theories in culture studies and the academy about being in a post-humanist cultural position. There's post-humanist art and there's post-humanist aesthetics and things like that. Transhumanism is more specifically the advocacy for humans' right and ability to become more than human through the application of technology. So obviously the idea of, or the term transhumanism has implicit within it human, transhuman, and posthuman, because the trans is between the human and the posthuman. Although we're constantly trying to elide that because we don't really I don't really believe that there's such a thing as a posthuman. I think there'll probably be people in 500 years who have green skin or wings or live in a box or whatever and consider themselves human because they're descendants from us. But at any rate, I agree with you about this interpretation. It's one of the things that I have tried to apply is to what extent does something like Iron Man reflect anxiety about actual cyborgization and to what extent does it reflect something more about attitudes towards science and in Tony Stark's case about the military-industrial complex.
It's a really interesting film, actually, and for those reasons.
Yeah.
Do you really think that those things can be separated, though? Because I feel like people, worry about, what humans are evolving into, and that's partly about worrying what science is doing to us, and what things beyond our control that industry is doing to us, especially industry connected to the government.
Right. I don't think they can necessarily be separated. But I guess I don't want to overinterpret from my transhumanist lens the notion that...
No, go for it. Give us an overinterpretation. That's the best.
Well, Iron Man, a lot of transhumanists got really excited about Iron Man, especially the libertarian ones, I have to say, because he was a do-gooder corporate industrialist who was using his wealth for the side of good. But Wall-E, I think, was a little bit more the politics that I would have preferred. But so there are these positive depictions. Like Wall-E is a positive depiction of robots who save the day. Iron Man and Batman, for that matter, a positive depiction of technologically empowered cyborgish humans who do good. And Twilight, reflects a kind of positive attitude towards vampires. This is actually, I have to say, what originally got me interested in this was Anne Rice, because it seemed like
really?
Anne Rice. Yeah, it was Anne Rice who, for me, tipped the notion that there were increasingly positive depictions of what had only been horror images in the past. That she made being a vampire sexy, and so I got very curious about whether there were increasingly positive images about vampires and other kinds of creatures, aliens and whatnot. And it all got really messy if you take something like X-Files. X-Files has some positive aliens in it and some other positive kinds of creatures in it, lots of different kinds of creatures. But it's mostly a horror genre, so almost all of those things are eating people or doing something you don't want them to do at some point.
Or taking over our bodies or whatever, yeah.
Right. And so that leads to another question about the kind of the politics, or the biopolitics at least, implicit in SF fantasy and horror. The kind of common observation that in horror, it's usually, the other is doing something bad, and in fantasy, you've got this kind of balance between good and bad. Like in the Tolkien universe, you've got intrinsically bad races and intrinsically good races. And in SF, you have depictions like Star Trek, where everybody can get along if we could just all be rational enough. But do you think that there's an implicit politics in these different genres or sub-communities?
I think that maybe 20, 30 years ago, you could have broken it down in that way. But I think now, especially with, urban fantasy and contemporary horror and paranormal romance, really being so popular and so diverse that you can have incredibly radical, transhumanist, socialist-style horror. You could have really retrograde science fiction. We already know science fiction can be very pro-military in a retrograde way, very conservative and libertarian. But, I think you're right to point out Anne Rice as being one of the pioneers in the kind of horror fantasy genre who wants us to become sympathetic to the monsters. I think now you have people like China Mieville, who's writing urban fantasy, essentially almost all of his novels are, who's dealing with a very complicated landscape where there's characters who are conservative, characters who are radicals. He has a novel, Perdido Street Station, which I highly recommend, which includes characters who are scientists. It has a kind of socialist underground newspaper in it, and then of course the city government, which is trying to prevent the scientist from doing what he's doing, and is secretly running this kind of drug production program by capturing moth people and forcing the moth people to poop and then selling the moth poop as drugs. And then there's these moments where they have to talk to Satan using a steam-driven telephone. And anyway, it's actually an amazing political novel, but which is set in this very fantasy type landscape.
I highly recommend all his novels. They're wonderful. But you raise an interesting point about the balance and the complexity. I mean, when I first started thinking about this as a transhumanist critic, I was thinking, well, what we really need is a posthuman anti-defamation league. And so all these writers and films that depict aliens or robots in negative light, we need to go out there and criticize that as bad politics. And then as I thought about it more, it's like, I don't want to be the, 21st century socialist realist where every proletarian has to be depicted as a positive person and every middle-class person has to be bad. What I really want is the post-cyberpunk kind of realism, a gritty, believable future in which people have complex motives and aliens and everybody else can be just as complex as they are today. And so I think that's actually the kind of progress I'm looking for, is to see writers and cultural products that don't rely on demonization of the other, but also don't valorize them in the way that, like, E.T. did.
Yeah, that isn't just this kind of almost like a white guilt version of fantasy, where, the other is placed on this ridiculous pedestal and isn't human. A couple things pop to mind really quickly, which is Ken MacLeod's one of his latest novels, The Night Sessions, which unfortunately has not been released in the U.S.
It's too radical.
It is quite radical, and it actually has robots in it who are artificially intelligent who become Christian evangelical terrorists.
Right.
Which I just thought was an incredibly intelligent idea to think about, like, okay, if we are modeling AI on our own consciousness, why wouldn't it create, evangelical Christian robots?
From fighting alongside their human brethren in anti-jihadist war in the Middle East. They bonded with their humans who were Christian fundamentalists. So I thought, it was fascinating.
Yeah, and also the thing that's even more interesting and complicated in that novel is that part of the reason why the robots are drawn to Christianity is that some of the only humans who will acknowledge that they have human rights and souls are Christians. And so, they're seeking to be treated like humans, and the only people who will do that are Christians who want to save their alleged robot souls. So it makes the Christian characters really complicated as well, and I think that's interesting. And the other author I would
go ahead.
Say quickly, the other author I would bring up is Octavia Butler, who sadly died a couple years ago. But she also has incredibly interesting, complicated depictions of aliens who are both colonizers and colonized at the same time, and terribly complicated and very interesting. So that would be my other vote for complicated transhumanist fiction.
Right. Well, Battlestar Galactica, you remind me of Battlestar Galactica as well, because there you had the complex interweave of religion and robot-human, and then eventually the synthesis of robot-human, literally a kind of synthesis in the bodies of ourselves. We're supposed to be.
Yeah, we're all descended from cyborgs, apparently. Which we kind of already knew.
I still don't understand that last episode, but of course they had to wrap up an awful lot. Well,
yeah, last episode was bad. Sorry about that.
Well, I recommend to everyone, as I have for a while, that they subscribe to the io9.com blog and read your stuff there. And you also have a blog, Texploitation, where you keep track of your own writing in other areas. Like
it's my personal blog, yeah.
Yeah, you used to write a lot of great stuff for Alternet, but I understand that being editor of IO9 must be pretty time-consuming.
Yeah, I'm sublimating all of it into IO9 now.
And doing a great job. So I look forward to seeing you in a couple weeks at our little Biopolitics of Popular Culture conference, and thanks for joining me today.
Yeah, thank you.